Horror is a genre of fiction and a human emotion response characterized by feelings of fear, dread, and terror. It is often associated with disturbing, frightening, or macabre elements that aim to evoke intense emotional reactions in the audience or the readers. Aesthetics is a branch of philosophy that delves into the nature, value, and principles underlying art, beauty, and the experience of aesthetic appreciation. At its core, aesthetics explores the subjective experience of aesthetic pleasure, encompassing the emotions, thoughts, and sensations that arise when an individual engages with art. A central focus of this philosophical field is the concept of beauty, which philosophers seek to define and understand, though it is often regarded as inherently subjective. In this video, we will explore how horror as a genre elicits specific aesthetic experiences and the unique qualities that distinguish it from other genres. We will do this by exploring the following questions. What exactly are we afraid of? Monsters? Ghosts? Dying? Or is it something else? And on a related note, why do we watch things that scare us? To address this question, we will talk about Aristotle's notion of catharsis as well as terror management theory. And secondly, what are the underlying philosophical assumptions of horror? We will examine this question by attempting to answer the related question, is the horror genre inherently conservative? In order to explore the horror genre in this video, we will primarily be focusing on film. I grew up watching horror films. I can't really say that it's one of my favorite genres, but it's what I'm most familiar with. And of course, as always, while we're discussing about these things, I would love to hear your thoughts and comments about horror as a genre, about aesthetics as a branch of philosophy in the comments section below. I hope that you enjoy this video, and I look forward to reading your responses. The philosopher of science Daniel Dennett once said that there's no such thing as philosophy-free science. In the same way, I think that we can say that there's no such thing as philosophy-free art. In other words, any piece of art that we're looking at, regardless of what sort of platform or genre of art that we're talking about, whether it's a painting, a movie, a song, any work of art is subject to philosophical inspection and philosophical reflection. And that's kind of the nature and purpose of aesthetics as the field and branch of philosophy. That being said, certain types of art, and especially once we start talking about literature and film, certain types of art and certain types of genre might inherently promote or deny certain types of philosophical ideas, if that makes sense. So when Dennett made that claim, he was looking at the sort of metaphysical implications of certain scientific theories, specifically Darwinian evolution. Or in my case, if I look at the philosophy of time, I would argue, of course, that the philosophy of time is deeply influenced and shaped by scientific theories like Einsteinian relativity, of course. With art, it's often been argued that certain genres may be subject to certain types of philosophical and or political leanings, and we'll get to that in the latter part of this video. But to begin with, I just want to make sure that we clarify some of our terms here. So as I outlined in my introduction to the philosophy video, philosophy is kind of divided into major disciplines: logic, ethics, metaphysics, epistemology, and of course, aesthetics. And as I explained in the introduction of this video, aesthetics is the branch of philosophy that deals primarily with art. Aesthetics explores questions of beauty, what makes something beautiful. It even asks sort of meta questions related to art, like what makes art art? Can we have a certain strict definition of art, or does art inherently resist these sorts of definitions? Aesthetics, like other branches of philosophy, is also closely related to other areas. So, for example, we might want to ask what sort of art is appropriate or inappropriate in society at large, or maybe even for our own individual viewing. So we have a connection there between aesthetics and ethics. And like other branches of philosophy, aesthetics nowadays, because of hyper specialization, can be kind of divided into all of these other areas, which often start with the philosophy of. So we could talk, generally speaking, the philosophy of art, and then we can get more specific. The philosophy of film, for example, we're going to be talking about mostly film today, but it should be noted kind of before we get started here that, like with most things in philosophy, there's going to be some disagreements about kind of how this categorization should take place and what exactly falls under the umbrella of aesthetics. Going back to that meta question I asked, what exactly is art? What do we lump into this category of art? And subsequently, what can we study through aesthetics? So, certain things have classically fallen under that category, such as fine art or maybe even literature. We'll talk a little bit about Aristotle in this video. Aristotle was one of the first people to write a book on aesthetics called the Poetics, in which he kind of outlines and breaks down tragic poetry. So, fine art and literature typically comes to people's mind. And nowadays, of course, because of the medium itself, film and television also come to people's mind as a form of art. But at certain places in time, so for example, like interior decoration, do we consider that a form of art? Do we consider things like dance and performance art a type of art? A lot of people, of course, would say yes. Do we consider more fringe things like martial arts? I mean, art is in the name, but is that a form of art? As you can see, this question gets pretty complicated pretty quickly. But we're going to leave all of that aside for the purpose of this video. In this video, like I said, big umbrella term is focused on ethics, but more specifically, it's focused on the philosophy of film, which people write about, there are books about, and we're going to narrow it down even more. And within the philosophy of film, just looking at the genre of horror more broadly speaking. Now, in order to approach the horror genre, I want to ask a general question to kind of get us thinking about this. What exactly makes a movie scary? Or you can even leave movie out of that. What exactly makes something scary? And if this were a classroom and we were having a discussion, one of the things you could talk about is, are there like common elements of fear? Are there universal aspects of horror or being afraid that people across culture and socioeconomic ethnic backgrounds are going to experience? Is fear something that's kind of at the root of our human experience, or is fear sort of inherently subjective and different people are going to find widely different things scary? Now, this question of what exactly is fear and what different things people find scary is actually reflected within the horror genre itself, because of course we have different types of horror movies, different types of fears that are being expressed that we can kind of loosely categorize into groupings. So, for example, we have supernatural horrors. These films involve supernatural elements like ghosts, demons, witches, other paranormal entities. Examples of this kind of classically include films like The Exorcist and more recently, Paranormal Activity. You have psychological horror, which is less focused on the paranormal or monsters and more focused on, as the name suggests, the psychological elements of our own minds. Psychological horror delves into the human psyche, focusing on mental instability, hallucinations, and the blurred line between reality and delusion. Examples of psychological horror can include things like the classic film Psycho and more recently Get Out. Then you have creature films or monster movies. Monster movies center around terrifying creatures such as vampires, werewolves, giant insects, and mutants. Notable examples include Dracula, the many different iterations of Dracula that we've seen over the past century, and of course, classic creature films like The Creature from the Black Lagoon. We even have like relatively new genres of horror that have emerged. Now, if you look at, I say new, because if you look at like ghost stories, we have examples of ghost stories from ancient Rome. But a newer genre, one that has become increasingly popular, is the genre of cosmic horror. Cosmic horror explores themes of existential dread, powerlessness, and the insignificance of humanity in the face of incomprehensible cosmic forces. This genre, of course, was popularized in literature by H.P. Lovecraft, but we've also seen it in film form with examples such as The Thing and Arrival. Now, when I ask you that original question, what are we afraid of? What makes a horror movie scary? This kind of gets to a deep rooted psychological question. And this is actually something that psychologists can study, is the fear response within the human being. But horror itself as a genre, and of course, feel free to disagree with me, is centered on this feeling of fear. Now, fear as a human experience comes in a wide variety of different shapes and forms, but some people have suggested that there's an underlying root cause of fear, that there could be kind of common elements of fear that are universal across across the human experience. Fear is the basic human emotion characterized by strong and often unpleasant emotional response to a perceived threat or danger. We're talking about this in psychological terms. This emotional response includes feelings of anxiety, unease, and apprehension. Fear is oftentimes triggered when an individual perceives a situation or stimulus as a threat to their physical or psychological well being. This threat can, of course, be real or imagined, immediate or future oriented. Now, within the realm of psychology, one of the common answers to what exactly are we afraid of is this idea that our sense of fear goes back to that sense of bodily harm or physical harm and is ultimately boils down to a fear of death. This is summarized by the early American psychologist and philosopher William James and his variety of religious experiences. James says that, quote, "At the back of everything is the great specter of universal death, the all-encompassing blackness. We need a life not correlated with death, a kind of good that will not perish, a good, in fact, that flies beyond the goods of nature." And so, with most of us, a little irritable weakness will bring the worm at the core of our usual springs. The worm at the core is our fear of death, of delight into full view, and turn us into melancholy metaphysicians. So, according to James, the root of all of our fears ultimately, at the end of the day, goes back to our fear of death. And that death, as a result, it can be thought of as one of the primary motivators in human actions and in human decision making. This idea has been taken up in various forms in 20th century psychology. We have a quote here by Ernest Becker, who wrote a book called The Denial of Death. And Becker is actually the father of what would become known as terror management theory, which we'll get to here in a second. But Becker says, kind of building off of what James had said earlier, we build character and culture in order to shield ourselves from the devastating awareness of underlying helplessness and terror of our inevitable death. So Becker's going to take this a step further and say that all of the things that have become prominent, especially in things like art, we oftentimes associate art with culture, for example. And Becker says that things like culture and the desire to produce and enjoy cultural artifacts ultimately stems from the fact of our knowledge of our own mortality. And the connection there is that culture is something that survives the death of the individual. So some culture is something that the individual will invest in ultimately because they're afraid of death and because of the feeling that they will produce something or be a part of something that will continue on after them. A different psychologist, Sigmund Freud, for example, would say the same thing about to try to explain our desire and our want to have children, that ultimately we want to have children in order to produce something that will outlive us. So this gets us into Becker's idea of terror management theory that he developed in the mid 20th century. And terror management theory is a psychological theory developed by a group of psychologists. Sorry, I said Becker. Becker actually comes later. Sheldon Solomon, Jeff Greenberg, and Thomas Polinsky in the 20th century. This theory seeks to explain how humans cope with the existential anxiety and fear of death by exploring the ways in which they manage and mitigate this fear. Terror management theory posits that humans have a unique awareness of their own mortality, and that it's this awareness that influences various aspects of human behavior. Now, within terror management theory, there are some proposed mechanisms that are utilized by the individual to manage this fear. And these mechanisms are not something that's like limited to one, but individuals will often have several of these present. First, as I mentioned before, you have cultural beliefs and values. Terror management theory suggests that one way humans cope with the fear of death is by adopting cultural worldviews or belief systems that provide a sense of meaning, significance, and continuity. These worldviews can be religious, political, or ideological and offer explanations about the nature of life, death, and afterlife. Tied in with culture is the production of cultural artifacts such as art. Next up, we have the idea of self-esteem as a mechanism. Self-esteem, managing a positive self-image and self-esteem serves as a buffer against existential anxiety. Self-esteem is used as a coping mechanism for this anxiety. It helps people to control their sense of terror and nullify the realization that humans are just animals trying to manage in the world around them. And according to terror management theory, self-esteem is a sense of personal value that is created by the beliefs and the validity of one's cultural worldview. and the belief that one is living up to the cultural standards created by that worldview. Finally, we have heroic pursuits. Some people engage in heroic or extraordinary actions as a way of achieving symbolic immortality and a sense of transcendence. This is something that we see featured in human culture going all the way back to the very first pieces of literature that we have, such as the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Iliad or the Odyssey. So, terror management theory would say that what we are ultimately afraid of is death. And that when we watch a horror movie, the reason why we're scared, of course, we get those mirror neurons firing, we put ourselves in the position of that person. But what makes us scared is the sense of harm, of the potential harm. And that ultimately what we are afraid of at the end of the day is one thing, and that's death, of dying. Now, I'm curious because oftentimes when I talk about this within a classroom setting, you get some people say, well, I'm not afraid of dying. So I'm curious as to what you all think of this. Is our fear of death kind of at the core of fear itself, and is that why we're scared? But this of course brings up a related question, which is, well, if we're afraid of death and horror movies make us aware of this realization, of this fear, then why exactly do we watch them? Are we just all sadists? Do we all just like to be afraid? Or is there something else that's happening here? And this is where Aristotle's idea of catharsis comes into play. Despite its capacity to terrify, horror can also offer catharsis as an opportunity for reflection. The aesthetics of horror allows the audience to confront their fears in a controlled environment and potentially gain insights into their own condition and maybe even the human condition at large. Aristotle's notion of catharsis is a key concept in a book that he wrote called The Poetics, a treatise on drama and literature. This concept refers to the emotional purification or purging that an audience would undergo when they experience strong emotions, particularly pity and fear, while watching a tragedy. Aristotle believed that this emotional cleansing through art, particularly through tragic drama, had a beneficial effect on the human psyche and was a crucial element of the aesthetic experience. We have a quote here from Aristotle from his Poetics. A tragedy, then, is the imitation of an action that is serious and also having magnitude complete in itself, in language, not in a narrative form, with incidents arousing pity and fear, wherewith to accomplish its catharsis of such emotions. According to Aristotle, watching a well crafted tragedy allows the audience to experience intense emotions, such as the quote suggests, pity and fear. As they empathize with the character's suffering and tragic downfall, these emotions are cathartic because they provide a release or purging of pent up feelings and tensions by the person watching it. Catharsis, in Aristotle's view, served as a psychological cleansing or purification, an emotional cleansing. It had a therapeutic effect on the peoples who were watching the tragedy or listening to the tragedy or even reading the tragedy, leaving them in a more balanced and emotionally healthy state after the experience. Now, Aristotle saw catharsis as the primary purpose of tragedy. And we can kind of use this argument to say that Aristotle might also say that the primary purpose of a genre like horror might be the catharsis that we experience in confronting our own mortality through the medium. And Aristotle argued that the witnessing of the suffering and downfall of the tragic character had both aesthetic value in that it enhanced the appreciation of the art form itself and an ethical value, encouraging moral reflection and empathy. So I'm going to take Aristotle's argument here and, of course, apply it to the horror genre. And this line of reasoning would suggest, if we take what we said about terror management theory, that at the core of our experience is this fear of death. And maybe this is what explains the fear that we experience, a common sort of universal human emotion and part of maybe even part of the human condition, if we want to phrase it in that language. And that the reason why we watch horror movies is to, in some way, shape, or form, to confront that fear by empathizing with the character, empathizing with the situation that they're in. Then horror, or the appreciation of horror, Aristotle uses ethical language to talk about this. with respect to tragedy, that watching a tragedy kind of invokes ethical reflection on our own life by watching what's happening to this other person, then horror would promote this sort of philosophical reflection on kind of these classic questions. What am I doing with my life? What is the meaning of my life? And then horror, if we take this line of reasoning, would be an inherently philosophical form of art, a philosophical pursuit. But I'm curious as to what y'all would think about that. So in this next section of the video, we're going to be looking at, this is kind of a, not necessarily a critique of the genre, but an analysis of some different sorts of films. And going back to that quote that I said at the beginning about from the philosopher Daniel Dennett, that there's no such thing as philosophy-free science, we're going to be examining some of the philosophical assumptions that lie at the root of a lot of these movies within the horror genre. And to do that, we're going to approach it by asking this question: is horror as a genre, as a whole genre, is it inherently conservative? Now, the reason why I'm asking this question and engaging with it is because it's been the subject of a couple of different articles that I've read, both on a popular and a philosophical level. But another less provocative way to phrase this would be like, what are some of the values that are being promoted by horror as a genre? What are some of the typical metaphysical claims of horror as a genre? What are some of the typical ethical claims of horror as a genre? Now, when I use the word conservative here, I do mean this in a political sense, but not political in terms of American politics, political in terms of, generally speaking, the philosophy of politics, political philosophy, which I have a video on, and I kind of cover the difference between conservatism as a philosophical position and liberalism as a philosophical position. But just briefly, to help with our discussion here, conservatism is a political and philosophical stance that emphasizes the importance of maintaining and conserving established social, cultural, ethical, and political norms. And this can come in the form of particular customs, social customs, or certain societal institutions like forms of government. Conservatism at its core is rooted in a belief in the value of tradition, continuity over time in terms of the continuity of a society, and stability as essential for the well-being of society itself. Conservatism often seeks to safeguard and protect the accumulated wisdom and practices of the past, viewing them as valuable guides for the present and the future. Classic conservatism, as I talk about in my political philosophy video, can be seen both in Eastern and Western traditions. In the West specifically, Confucianism as a philosophical system can be seen as a type of conservatism in the attempt that it sought to maintain traditional ethical practices, although it did modify these ethical practices in terms of filial piety. But I have a whole video on that if you're interested. Now, the reason why I frame this question, is the horror genre inherently conservative, is because horror seems on a surface level anything but conservative, right? Horror movies are littered with extreme violence, graphic nudity, the things that we typically tend to not associate with conservative values. But horror has been charged with being conservative by some pretty well-known critics, and even authors of horror such as Stephen King have called it conservative. But why would they call it conservative? Well, I'm actually going to let a horror movie itself answer this question.
Here comes.
What is so wrong? Why do they do that? It's too red.
Wait, here comes another. Hearing.
Ooh! Yes! Predictable. I knew he was gonna bite it. How can you watch this shit over and over? Shh! When do we see breasts? I want to see Jamie Lee's breasts. When do we see Jamie Lee's breasts?
Breast? Not until Trading Places in '83. Jamie Lee was always the virgin in horror movies. She never showed her tits until she went legits.
Could afford a decent pair.
What'd you say? That's why she always outsmarted the killer in the big chase scene at the end. Only virgins can do that. Don't you know the rules? What rules? You don't... Jesus Christ, you don't know the rules?
Have an aneurysm, why don't you?
There are certain rules that one must abide by in order to successfully survive a horror movie. For instance, number 1, you can never have sex. No. Big no. dead, man. Keep him in popcorn. Sex equals death, okay? Number 2, you can never drink or do drugs. No, the sin factor. It's a sin. It's an extension of number 1. And number 3, never, ever, ever, under any circumstances, say, I'll be right back. Because you won't be back.
I'm getting another beer. You want one?
Yeah, sure.
I'll be right back.
You see, you push the laws and you end up dead. Okay, I'll see you in the kitchen with a knife.
So that, of course, was from the 1996 horror film Scream, in which they go through the 3 laws or rules of horror movies. But Scream itself as a film is a reflection on this idea that there are certain ideas and practices that are evident in horror films, specifically the slasher films of the 80s. Now we have some quotes here from some horror movie authors, writers, and directors themselves, as well as some horror critics kind of speaking to this point about the inherent conservatism of horror films. Stephen King, in his essay, Why We Crave Horror Movies, says that we also get to reestablish our feelings of essential normality. The horror movies is innately conservative, even reactionary. King's idea is that horror movies are, again, we're using this word conservative a little loose here, but horror movies are conservative in the sense that they reinforce our basic beliefs about ourselves and our basic fears that we all have. And horror movies assure us that other people feel the same way or have felt the same way. But critiquing the genre itself in terms of its conservative values, as depicted in the Scream film, we have this next quote. And this quote is specifically about those 80s slasher films. And when I talk about 80s slasher films, I'm talking about movies like the first Halloween movie, all of the Freddy Krueger movies, all of the Jason movies, the Chucky movies. These are kind of the films that I grew up watching. But that's what I mean by the slasher genre. And concerning the slasher genre, Sue Bankson says, quote, these largely apolitical movies packed with exploitive carnage and sex nonetheless have a common theme that the moral majority types can get behind. If you're a kid who has premarital sex, does drugs, binge drinks, and parties like a fool, you will be severely punished. So what this quote is pointing out, and what the clip from Scream is pointing out, is that there are certain ethical assumptions and values that are in these horror movies. Even if these movies, like you watch a film like the first Freddy Krueger movie or Jason, you're not really thinking about philosophy when you're watching it. You're watching it either for the shock value, or you grew up. I can't really watch those films, so I'm not actually quite sure why people watch them. But typically speaking, they don't invoke philosophical reflection. But what's being pointed out here is that these films are pushing a sort of moral framework. And that moral framework is inherently conservative. It's conservative in the sense that the people within these films get punished for doing things like having sex outside of marriage, teenagers that are partying, and at these partying, they're doing drugs. And it's conveying the message that if you do these things, what's going to happen? Bad things are going to happen, or this serial killer is going to show up, that you're going to be punished. And it also reinforces this moral idea, and this idea goes all the way back in human history, that the reason why bad things happen to people is because they have done something wrong, that they're being punished for some previous action or action that they are currently doing. But we can also say, aside from ethics, that these films are promoting a conservative view of metaphysics or cosmology, because if you look at the horror of these films, such as Freddy Krueger, Jason, Chucky, what's driving the horror, Freddy Krueger is essentially like a demon. Or if you look at what I mentioned before, the film Paranormal Activity, I remember watching that in high school. It scared the crap out of me. Films that focus on ghost, monsters, interdimensional killer. I don't know what Freddy Krueger is. Is he a demon or something? I don't know. Travels through dreams. Films that focus on these things promote a conservative metaphysics, in that they're promoting the existence of things like Ghost, another classic film, The Exorcist, right? The reason why some people may have found The Exorcist scary is because they might believe that it's a possibility, that demons might actually be able to possess people because demons exist. But on the same hand, you can certainly think of some counterexamples to this, right? So if I were going to make the argument that horror movies are inherently conservative, how would you rebut me? Like, what are some examples that you could give that would contradict that point? And we'll talk about that. But so let's talk about this dichotomy and distinction. And again, the purpose of talking about this is to get you to think about this when you're watching a film, of what sort of implicit philosophical ideas are being presented here. Okay, so we'll talk about conservative and liberal assumptions made by horror movies. So there are certain common conservative assumptions made by horror movies. First, we have this emphasis on tradition and order. Some horror movies feature traditional settings or scenarios where established norms and values are disrupted by supernatural or monstrous forces. In these cases, the narrative may emphasize the importance of maintaining tradition and order in the face of chaos or the unknown. A classic example of this, of course, would be the 1980s Poltergeist movie. In this movie, a family's home is invaded by this malevolent supernatural force. I'll never forget the classic scene of the little girl sitting in front of the TV. The film's resolution, of course, involves restoring that order and normalcy, aligning with the idea of maintaining kind of the existing status quo. You have conservative assumptions in the form of the sort of morality that's presented. Many horror films incorporate moral lessons or consequences for characters' actions. For example, characters who engage in risky or immoral behavior may suffer dire consequences, which can be seen as promoting conservative ideas of personal responsibility and moral behavior. Like I said before, consider any of the slasher flicks there. Third, defense of family and community. Some horror films center on the defense of family, friends, or the local community against external threats. These narratives can promote the idea that close-knit communities and strong social bonds are essential for survival and protection in the face of danger. A classic example of this is 2018's A Quiet Place, I'm sorry. The film centers on a family struggling to survive in a world inhabited by these deadly creature alien things. I can't remember. Are they aliens? And it promotes the idea that family bonds and cooperation are crucial for this survival. And as I said, religious metaphysics is assumed by a lot of these films, classically by films like The Exorcist, but even more recently in these ghost or haunting films. And it's conservative in the sense that these are traditional ideas and beliefs about the afterlife and what happens after we die. Likewise, I said you could probably think of some counterexamples. There are certain genres of, not genres, there are certain kind of groups of examples of horror films that we could also argue embody liberal assumptions and liberal values. And again, liberalism, I'm talking about here not in terms of American politics per se, although there is a lot of overlap, of course, but liberalism is a philosophical and political idea that encompasses a range of different principles, but at its core, when we talk about liberalism, is typically characterized by a commitment to individual liberty and the preserving of that individual liberty, equality, and the protection of certain rights and freedoms of the individual. And so we have examples of this in horror films in the form of social commentary. Many horror films incorporate social commentary on issues such as inequality, discrimination, or societal injustices. You see this a lot, especially in recent horror films. These movies may use supernatural or monstrous elements as metaphors for real world problems, encouraging viewers to reflect on and address these issues. All of Jordan Peele's movies take this route, no matter if you're talking about Get Out, Us, or what's the most recent one he did with the alien thing? I don't want to give spoilers. What is it? Nope. All of these are like horror movies in the traditional sense, but they're also sometimes very thinly disguised social commentary. Get Out specifically, one of my favorites. This film combines horror with social commentary on racism and microaggressions. It serves, of course, as a powerful allegory for racial discrimination and the exploitation of Black bodies, encouraging viewers to reflect on these social issues. Horror movies can also challenge established norms. Some horror movies subvert or challenge traditional norms and values, pushing viewers to question societal conventions and consider alternative perspectives. These films can be seen to champion individuality and nonconformity. A good example of this is 2014's The Babadook. Babadook? Yeah, I think that's how you say it. I saw that movie a while ago. I can't remember because they keep chanting it throughout the movie. I remember that. This movie explores themes of motherhood and mental health while challenging traditional family norms, focusing on a single mother, portrays the single mother's struggle with her own inner demons and societal expectations. Other liberal assumptions may involve ideas about the environment and health concerns. We do have some definite overlap here with current American politics. Certain horror movies involve themes related to environmental degradation, pandemics, or public health crises. These films raise awareness about these issues and in some cases advocate for these issues. There's a slew of natural disaster films. Sometimes they have overtly political messages, sometimes they don't. So, for example, I'm thinking one of my childhood favorite movies was the movie Twister. That didn't really have like a overtly political idea to it. It's just kind of a disaster movie. But you have films like the 2011 Contamination. It's more of a thriller, but it deals with ideas of like a pandemic or any like zombie outbreak film or TV series. There's going to be elements of political commentary, especially just having gone through COVID, that's going to immediately come to people's minds. Horror films can also critique authority in the form of traditional values, practices, or governmental authority. We see this, for example, in 2015, The Witch, which was set in 17th century New England. This film explores the oppressive authority of Puritan family religious beliefs and consequences, although at the same time, it does maintain conservative values in the sense that you have the dancing goat devil thing. So it's promoting a kind of a religious metaphysics as well. But you also see it, and this is not really a horror movie, so I feel kind of bad putting it there, but like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest with 1975. It's more of a drama than a traditional horror film, but it does critique authority, and it also shed light on political issues or potential political issues like the mental health system in the United States. So I bring up this dichotomy between conservative and liberal just because this could be a fun way to analyze or critique horror films, any horror film of your choosing, by asking the question like, what exactly is being presented here? Beyond the monster, beyond the slasher, beyond the demon or whatever is the central action of the film, what sort of ideas are being promoted? And that gets to that philosophical analysis that we were talking about at the beginning. Horror movies often delve into deep and thought-provoking themes that touch on human nature, morality, society, and the unknown. Horror movies convey philosophical ideas through storytelling, symbolism, character development, and the exploration of human experience and fears. Horror movies create a unique cinematic space where filmmakers can explore and convey complex philosophical ideas through storytelling, symbolism, and the visceral experience of fear and dread. These movies encourage viewers to engage with philosophical themes and questions in a visceral and emotionally charged way, making them a rich source for philosophical exploration and analysis. I hope that you enjoyed this breakdown of the horror genre. Again, please feel free to leave me your thoughts in the comments section and reach out to me. And until next time, I will see you all later.